Margaret Brennan is in the room and watched that press conference. Margaret, what jumped out to you during this press conference, which took place moments after a shooting and potential terror incident in Paris?
Right. Well, you did hear the president, when he was asked about that incident, seemed to confirm, at least from his perspective, that it appeared to be a terrorist attack. Didn't give much further detail, just to say this is essentially the new normal. But as for the content of the president's remarks, one of the things that stood out to me the most was this sort of mysterious reference to what he says is real progress being made in terms of pressuring North Korea to end its provocative actions and the pursuit of its nuclear program. He said specifically the last 2 to 3 hours we have seen progress. He didn't give any detail or context exactly what he was looking at. It may be, if we are judging from other news reports out there, a reference to Beijing looking at cutting all fuel supplies to Pyongyang. We have seen some reports hit the wires recently, so perhaps it's that. We don't know. I'm going to try to chase that down after we're done here. But the president seemed to be saying that he sees some kind of light at the end of the tunnel here with North Korea. He would not respond to questions about the mental state of its rather mercurial and young leader, Kim Jong-un. You also did hear the president lay out some parameters for the willingness he has to help to stabilize Libya, basically saying, I don't have an appetite, I don't see a role for the U.S., but he did see one when it comes to continuing to fight ISIS there. If you remember, the Obama administration authorized special operators to take the fight to ISIS there on the ground in Libya, as well as from the air. And this had been seen as sort of a third major battlefront of the U.S. versus ISIS, as that main war is fought in Syria, where ISIS continues to be headquartered, as well as its stronghold in Iraq, where they've really been pushed off the battlefield. So the president and the Italian prime minister sort of spoke about that in almost completely finished terms there, saying, you know, there's real progress that's being made. On the domestic front, we had questions here from reporters trying to make some news, trying to get some clarity here, Errol, because most government departments lose their federal funding next week, April the 28th, unless there is some kind of bipartisan agreement on Capitol Hill as to how to keep the government funded. And so that's why that question was put to the president, saying, are you going to prevent a government shutdown? And he sort of dodged the question, sort of half-jokingly saying, of course we don't want the government to shut down, without really referencing whether there was any progress in doing so. From what we're hearing, the president really doesn't want to be seen as taking a direct role in that. He wants to leave that to the Republican leadership to hash out with Democrats. But of course, some of the president's funding requests, if he pushes for funding for the wall he wants to build between the U.S. and Mexico, for instance, could really cause problems to getting to an answer and a funding mechanism so that American government agencies can continue to be funded beyond the end of the month.
Yeah, it was interesting to hear, Margaret, his response to Jordan Fabian of The Hill asking, when you want to get health care or a budget passed, what would you like to do next week? And to hear him say both. Is there a sense why the president has this renewed optimism about health care going through? We know it's such a difficult. He even acknowledged it took 17 months for President Obama. What are you hearing from sources there?
Well, what we're hearing certainly from Capitol Hill and the leadership there is that they don't think this is something that they're going to put on the front burner, because they're very worried about getting other more immediate things done, like funding the governments to avoid a government shutdown. So that's why that was presented as sort of a binary choice by the reporter. Do you want health care next week, or do you want government funding? But what we are hearing from the White House is that they really did want to get some kind of signal of progress in some form, if not actual agreement, by next week, because we are looking at that 100-day mark for the Trump administration. And this administration is nothing if not keenly aware of its own press and its own record there. They have touted, the president himself has touted what he sees as a new government that's kind of hit the ground running, an administration that he says has really brought a level of efficiency to the White House that he complained wasn't here before. Of course, critics, many of them who served in past administrations, and many Republicans would say what the president has done is a lot of executive orders that have asked for research and reports, but not actually created any new laws, not actually created any solutions to the problems that he points out. So we do have a lot of open-ended policy changes that the president has promised that he hasn't yet completed or followed through on. So they're keenly aware of that report card because that 100-day mark is right around the corner. And health care, the inability of the president to get his own party's plan to replace and repeal Obamacare is a real sore point for them.
And one more quick question for you, Margaret, before you have to run on NATO. President Trump had softened his language from the campaign trail in calling it obsolete. He made it clear recently it is not obsolete, but he was asked directly if he thought Italy should be paying a full 2% of its GDP toward to fund the alliance, and the president said he enjoyed that question and will be asking the Italian Prime Minister directly. What was the Italian Prime Minister's response to that, and what did you make of it?
He dodged it a bit. Listen, Italy doesn't fully the requirement of all NATO members is that they spend 2% of their own GDP on their own defense to meet that NATO standard. So the argument from the American administration, the current one and the past one, was, look, you can't care more. We can't care more about your kids' security than you do. You need to pay for your own defense in Europe. But that's not money going to NATO. It's just helping to shoulder the burden there of meeting that NATO standard. And within Italy, they haven't met that. There is some real skepticism about really fully funding the military in that way or pouring money into defense. Culturally, it's looked at in a very different way than it is here in the United States. There are other countries in Europe, too, who don't feel that it is culturally appropriate necessarily to really spend so much of your gross domestic product on defense. So it's still an issue, but you did hear the Prime Minister sort of diplomatically say, we know it's an issue and we fully support NATO and we'll look to continue to do that. So it was an interesting moment to have such a direct question put very appropriately to the Prime Minister of Italy, but then have the president double down on that and say, well, I want to hear what he has to say, because clearly the president didn't get the answer to the question he wanted in their private session and sort of enjoyed publicly watching the Italian Prime Minister being put on the spot there.
Something we've seen many times when he has foreign leaders here in the past with Israel, and today our Margaret Brennan coming to us from the White House. We look forward to your reporting tonight
Thank you,
on
Margaret.
the evening news, Margaret.
Thanks.